Good afternoon from Dreich, Chicago. My name is Gus Noble. Next week, the world will look to Scotland as Glasgow hosts the United Nations Climate Conference COP26. In order to unify a global response to what is now a climate emergency, a 1992 UN treaty bound every country on Earth to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a globally equitable way. Since then, world governments have met nearly every year, and Glasgow's conference is the 26th meeting of COP, which stands for Conference of the Parties. It'll run from the 31st of October to the 12th of November and be attended by over 25,000 people, including 120 world leaders. Today, we will look to COP26 and beyond through the eyes of experts Jamie Crawford, Jerry Adelmann, Jeff Waddell, and Cal Flyn. Over the next hour, we'll discuss the climate emergency from minute details to the big picture, its causes, effects, and how we can, indeed how we must respond in order to stem and stop its worst impacts. Thank you for joining today with the Chicago Scots, Illinois' first and oldest non-profit organization. I particularly want to thank those of you who believe in Chicago Scots' principal charity, Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care, where an impeccable record of safety during the pandemic, just one resident case, has been made possible by the commitment, COVID carefulness, and love of the incredible people who live and work in this unique community. I offer special appreciation from my Chicago Scots colleagues and our friends and partners, the National Trust for Scotland USA, Openlands, and the Scottish Government USA, who helped bring together today's expert panel. Thank you. Now, a word on how today's discussion will work. There will be 4 areas for examination: people, social justice and equity, nature, and the built environment. Each area will begin with a short video from one of our experts, who will then speak for 4 or 5 further minutes. And then each of the other 3 experts will have up to 2 minutes to respond by citing practical examples of problems, solutions, and successes. Each of our experts has incredible experience, and we have a lot to cover, so timing will require some precise policing. But if I do my job correctly, we will have some time for questions at the end of today's discussion. And if you have a question, please ask it at any point during today's presentations in the Q&A interface, where it will be seen by all the experts and by my colleagues. And if your question is to be directed to one of the experts, please specify accordingly. Now, to lead us through our examination of the first area, people, I welcome Jamie Crawford. As a publisher of Historic Environment Scotland, Jamie advanced culture, education, heritage, and environmental protection. And as a writer and broadcaster, Jamie helps a country tell her story. And especially in the case of the BBC's incredible Scotland from the Sky, he made this Scotsman feel very homesick.
Scotland is one of the most beautiful, most photographed countries in the world. And for me, it's a place best seen from the sky.
It's absolutely stunning seeing it from this angle. Not something you get to do every day.
This viewpoint always has the power to astound.
The view from above isn't just about spectacular mountains and dramatic castles. The view from above offers a whole new way of understanding our history.
Much of Scotland might seem a natural wilderness, but almost all of this has been transformed by people. In this episode, I want to explore how the view from the air offers clues to how we've lived off the land over thousands of years. from ancient fields on remote islands.
It's on the edge, isn't it? Next stop's America out there.
To how loggers have changed our forests.
You're knackered after every day, but it is good. It's really rewarding.
And revolutions in farming.
In the last couple of generations, there's been a huge change on how we farm from my grandfather, who would have had a horse-drawn plough.
Scotland's land reflects who we are and who we've been.
If we want to restore and protect it today, we have to understand what we've done to it, the good and the bad, going all the way back to the very beginning.
Jamie, yours is a unique perspective. Guy, few know Scotland as you do. Through your eyes, how does this climate emergency affect Scotland as a place and Scotland as a people?
Thanks, Gus. And apologies for that slightly glitchy video and the lack of sound earlier on, but hopefully everyone watching got the gist. I'm going to answer that question in a slightly oblique way, as I want to do. To give a bit of context, that clip comes from the second series of the documentary Scotland from the Sky. And I think it was one of the episodes where we probably looked in the broadest terms at the human impact on the landscape. But the main thread running through that episode was the disappearance of tree cover. Because if you go back, say, 5,000 years, about something in the region of 3/4 to 4/5 of Scotland was covered in trees. By the start of the 20th century, it was down to just about 5%. So the basic question that we were asking in that episode was, what happened to all the trees? How did we drop from near 80% to 5%? Now, a simple answer to that is we cut them all down. More complex is to consider why and when and what for and what other factors were involved, including the changing climate which had an impact. Because, of course, trees are part of an ecosystem. They don't exist in isolation. People are part of an ecosystem too, but clearly somewhere along the way the balance has shifted, and as it is with trees, so it is with the rest of the planet, really. And I think one of the key themes in all these discussions that we're having, that people are going to be having around COP26, is this term wilderness. Scotland's a great example of this. People both in this country, and particularly I think those coming from outside, they look at Scotland and they see large swathes of it as this kind of pristine stretches of untouched wilderness, beautiful, almost sort of pre-lapsarian landscape. And the reality, as I explored in that episode, but really as we explore in all the series of Scotland from the Sky, is the incredible extent to which people have impacted on pretty much every inch of the landscape here. So the Scotland that we see today, that delights so many tourists who come here, that's the creation of people. And to take just one example, in the same episode that clip comes from, we travel to the Isle of Staffa. Now, it's famous around the world as a sort of natural wonder. It's the site of a place called Fingal's Cave. It's this incredible cathedral of rock. It's formed by the cooling of basalt. You can see it there. And it's a really stunning and remarkable site. And over the sort of 18th and 19th centuries, there was almost like a who's who of the society of that time who went to visit. People like Keats and Turner and Tennyson and Walter Scott, Mendelssohn, Jules Verne, William Wordsworth, Robert Louis Stevenson, even Queen Victoria. And they all came to look at the cave. And what they didn't really pay very much attention to was the land on top of where the cave was. It's this little plateau of grass. It's just 33 hectares. And when we looked at it from above, you could see that it was ridged and lined everywhere, that the whole surface was this mass of humps and depressions. It was a kind of landscape almost in corrugation, if you like. And that was because the soil had clearly been worked and farmed. So the question is, when was it worked and for how long? And a couple of years ago, an archaeological investigation discovered a burnt grain of hulled barley in the clay subsoil. And that grain was dated to the Middle Bronze Age, which is around 1800 BC. So nearly 4,000 years ago. So even on this tiny, remote, seemingly wild and natural island, people have been working the land since the earliest times, which I suppose brings me back to the message that was at the end of that video clip, that if we want to restore and protect the land that we have today, we have to understand what we've done to it, you know, what people have done to it, going back to the very beginning. That brings me back to those trees. That 5% coverage of Scotland's landmass from around the time of World War I has risen to around 20% today. And I think the target for 2050 is to be about 25%. So the trees are making a comeback. Although even within that, I think it's only in the region of 4% that's actually native trees. And that's something I'm sure that Jeff is going to go on to talk about. But also in that context, I think it's fascinating to look at what Cal explores in her book, because I'm sure we'll hear about post-human landscapes, because there's the extent to which so much, perhaps you could argue even everything going forward, conservation or rewilding or restoring ecosystems, that's effectively happening in these human impacted landscapes or even post-human landscapes. And I think to answer the question, that's ultimately the canvas we're looking at. That's the playing field we have going forward for anything we do to the planet.
Thank you, Jamie. In response, our other three experts will have up to 2 minutes, and I'll come to you first, Jerry, followed by Jeff, and then Cal. Jerry.
Great. Well, Jamie, thank you for sharing that. What an exciting project, Scotland Sky. I mean, the series, I think, has probably connected more people to the land than almost any other tool, any book or whatever. The power of photography, of visual images, of film, you know, to do that is really extraordinary. A person who was a great influence in my work was the great landscape historian W.G. Hoskins, you know, who did Reading the Land and had his TV series and book and so forth, but looking at the interaction of people in the land over time. In our region, the same kinds of stories, parallels in terms of loss of biodiversity. Less than 1/10 of 1% of the original Illinois prairie survives in Illinois, the prairie state. Less than 10% of our wetlands and so forth. And so we've used projects also, like we had a wonderful program called Revealing Chicago. Terry Evans, a fabulous landscape photographer, spent 1.5 years photographing the region from hot air balloon, helicopter, and airplane. We had an outdoor exhibit in one of our new parks. It triggered a major conversation about policy and land use and open space preservation and what the role we have as humans. Earlier, Openlands, my organization, put together an exhibit at the Art Institute here in Chicago, first time ever, of images of the Midwest, of the prairie, from the dawn of photography to the present. But these were tools that, you know, points of entry for people that maybe gave them an easier access than, you know, scientific, you know, sort of data and more abstract information. So the power of art, of photography, of film, to tell the story, to connect people to place, and to have them understand better their role as we move forward in this very challenging time is really impressive. And thank you for your great work. Very impressive.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. And Jamie, I've seen your program. I think it's brilliant. And I think one of the important things that it does is it's educational. And I think with climate change, we really need to improve sort of knowledge of how we manage the land, because it really is key to unlocking the solutions to climate change. I mean, in the UK, I'm sure in all our countries, we hear politicians pledging to plant an extra 1 billion trees or 1 million trees or whatever. But from ecological point of view, it's so important that they're the right kind of trees and that they're planted or regenerated in the right kind of way, because in Scotland just now, we're seeing a lot of afforestation, but unfortunately, it's not ecologically designed. We're talking about non-native trees, which ecologically don't fit into Scottish ecosystems, and we're planted in monocultures. And that's important for commercial forestry. We need that timber to build our houses for industry. But from the ecological point of view, from the climate change point of view, we really need native trees because they lock up carbon longer. They're always out there. And also, it just brings back biodiversity. So we need to get this balance right between native trees, locking up carbon, using timber productively. And I think the way it's going just now in Scotland, unfortunately, quite a lot of our forestry is economic and it isn't ecologically designed. And although that's important, we need to achieve timber, obviously. We need to get that balance right. And National Trust for Scotland, our kind of role in forestry is to restore native woodlands. So we're doing that at places like Mar Lodge, West Africa, and we're looking at our remnants of native woodland. We're reducing the deer to sustainable levels, and that's allowing the woodland to regenerate.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just chime in. One thing I really love about your work, Jamie, is that sense of getting a new perspective, like quite literally upon the land. And as you say, sort of looking at, say, the surface of Staffa and paying attention and seeing how history sort of unfolds in the physical landscape around us. And one thing that really sort of struck me while I was researching my own book was how aerial photography sort of has really helped us understand how human history has unfolded in even sort of longer periods. So for example, like LiDAR surveying of the Amazon basin has revealed all of these sort of ancient civilizations that actually we weren't sure existed until very recently. And now we find these enormous earthworks that are shrouded in forest. And one thing that makes me think about is that sense of how, when it comes to the climate and also more generally conservation and the ecosystems around us, is we have to start thinking in terms of longer than a human lifespan, longer than, you know, decades, centuries into the future, because we can see how much the world around us can change in that period of time. You know, you can completely forget that a whole civilization existed and suddenly we see the return of forest on such a grand scale that we now think of the Amazon as being a pristine ecosystem, which, as you pointed out, is not. And so we have to learn how to value the land around us in terms of its potential in the future and not always see it as degraded, but rather the forest, carbon sinks, grasslands, whatever it is that it could be given the right opportunities.
Well, thank you very much to the lead speaker there, Jamie. And next we'll move to an examination of the climate emergency in the context of social inclusion and equity by looking through the eyes of Jerry Adelmann. Jerry is CEO of Openlands, which protects the natural and open spaces of the region around Chicago, ensures clean air, land and water, advocates for policy solutions, protects natural habitats, and helps balance and enrich lives. I have immense admiration for my friend Jerry and his colleagues at Openlands, and they say it plain. Social equity and inclusion is intrinsically linked to our fight for climate justice. Now we're going to show the video. Jerry, the world's climate and biodiversity crisis calls for protecting 30% of the Earth's lands and waters by 2030. Openlands is one of the first conservation organizations in the United States to work in a dense metropolitan region. What are the implications of 30 by 30 for your work?
Well, Gus, as you point out, 30 by 30 is an international campaign, and many nations and organizations are buying into it. Recently, a few months ago, President Biden launched America the Beautiful, which is his framework, for dealing with climate, especially nature-based solutions to climate. So there's a real kind of tension there. I mean, we've got to get to scale. And so that means large landscapes, ranches, wilderness, tropical rainforest, coastal areas. And yet 80% of Americans now live in metropolitan areas, 50% of the world's population. So, and it's many of, especially low-income communities, communities of color that are suffering the greatest, impacts from negative climate, health issues, flooding, heat islands, all sorts of things. The last 2 years, I would argue, have been the most challenging in many ways of our generation. And we have this trifecta of health, social, and environmental climate crises all coming together. So to exclude cities from these programs, to try to get to those big numbers, many have argued, would be environmental racism, really. Fortunately, nature-based solutions address both human and environmental climate needs in powerful ways. And the Biden administration recognizes it's a both and. As you pointed out, Openlands, we were formed in 1963, and one of the first conservation organizations to work in a large metropolitan area. We work in the southern shore of Lake Michigan, in this 3-state metro area, very complicated geopolitically, more units of local government than any other metropolitan area in the country. That's a dubious distinction, but a challenge, obviously. So a not-for-profit like us can kind of cut through all of that and look at the big picture at that web of green. And so we do get involved in big-scale policy, planning, urban planning issues. And then we work on the ground, protecting land, restoring land, but also doing specific programs. So that's really what you saw little snippets of, in that very short video. One of them is along the Little Calumet River in an area in Chicago that is a post-industrial landscape, serious environmental challenges, brownfields, so forth. Largely African-American residential communities that are very isolated with very few services. They're adjacent to a lovely forest preserve, but you can't access it from where they live. Along the river, there's a lot of vacant, derelict land. You can't even see the river. And so the community came together to develop a vision, for that land that includes, among other things, community gathering places, places to do ecological restoration to address flooding and habitat restoration, erosion issues, access to the river and so forth. But an element of it is the African-American Heritage Water Trail. So a 7-mile stretch along this river, you saw people who were doing canoeing and kayaking there. That tells a story that's amazing. An underground railroad site before the Civil War for freedom seekers who were on their way to Canada, the Ton Farm. It's the birthplace of the environmental justice movement here. It's where Barack Obama got his start as an organizer. At one end of it in Robbins, there was an airport. This is where the African-American Tuskegee Airmen, who were legendary during World War II, where they trained. So connecting people to place in powerful ways with these stories, but we're there determining the agenda. You have to have community engaged in a leadership role from the beginning all the way through to implementation. Extraordinary number of partners, public and private. In a similar way that with schools and space to grow, in Chicago, most of our schoolyards have been paved over. We're built on a swamp, and so huge flooding problems, heat islands, and hostile environments for kids. And so this total transformation of these campuses as places to learn, to play, to connect with nature, also to function as parks for neighbors and schools out there, very powerful. But the brilliance of it is it also addresses flooding and heat islands in dramatic ways that open up funding sources from our Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, the city of Chicago and Chicago Public Schools, those first to have money to get water in the ground where it falls. So we can monitor that and build it into the plan and show those huge impacts. The third is community forestry. And of course, in Chicago, our canopy has gone down from 19 to 16%. Huge challenges. And again, community is key, and jobs. We've been working very closely with the Biden administration and Senator Durbin on a new civilian conservation corps, climate corps. We have an apprenticeship program. But I think what's key here for people to enter into forestry is that people and equity must be at the core of climate and clean energy investments. And that really it's our urban populations here in America and around the world that I think are the future of the planet in so many ways. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. I've enjoyed time along the canal, and I appreciated your hosting me for the visit. It was such a wonderful day. And now in response, we'll go to our other three experts who will have up to 2 minutes to respond. And this time, first I'll come to Jeff, followed by Cal, and then to Jamie. Jeff.
Thanks, Gus. And Jerry, it's so nice to hear that there's other conservation movements going on elsewhere in the world, because, I mean, obviously my career has been spent in conservation in Scotland, and unless this sort of activity is happening all over the planet, it's not going to work. We're not going to solve the climate and the biodiversity emergency. So really nice to hear that there's good things like this going on, even in sort of metropolitan areas of the USA. And the second thought I had is about the engagement that you're doing with nature. It's so important to engage people with nature, because if they don't understand something, if they don't care about it, then we're not going to succeed in beating the climate and the biodiversity crises. We need to get everyone on board. We need to get everyone understanding, engaging, doing what they can do in their backyard. And then it made me think, I mean, I've got an 11-year-old son here in Edinburgh, and I think kids nowadays, we're really sort of tuned into climate change. They're really worried, really concerned, really engaged with it. But the sort of tragic thing is, kids nowadays, they don't get so much contact with nature as I did, or my dad before me did, where there was more access to nature. So we need to put that connection back so that kids can go out there, they can play in woods, can play in meadows, and they can learn to understand and appreciate nature. So thanks very much, Jerry. It's a great job.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. That was super interesting to hear. And I was really interested actually in what you were saying about sort of post-industrial landscape and dealing with sort of areas of like vacant and derelict land. Now, as you'll soon hear in my presentation, I'm a big fan of vacant and derelict land, but I do understand that there is a kind of trade-off, especially in an urban environment, of wanting also to be surrounded by places that feel nice to be in and they feel safe and so on. So we're understanding that often vacant derelict land can be a lot more ecologically virile and valuable than it looks at first sight. And I think scientists, especially ecologists, are coming to understand the true value of these brownfield sites and what they can hold, especially in terms of invertebrate life. But also you want to have that link with a local community to go and actually spend time in a place, and especially to have that sort of hands-on interaction that you were talking about there. And I think especially when you live in a city, it can be easy to feel that you don't have connection with the natural world at all. But actually, I do think that in all places, there are always sort of scraps of land and these sort of metaphorical islands of natural landscapes in every form. So whether that takes the form of a park or whether that takes the form of a verge or a sort of derelict site, all of these things are important to the world, and they all harbor different species, and they're all sort of safe havens for life amidst us. And I think it really helps me understand how humans sort of sit in this matrix of other species by understanding that even when it feels like we're in a deeply human place, we are surrounded by other lives going on all the time. So thank you so much for your work, and it was great to hear about it.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. Really fascinating. And I think one of the things I find particularly interesting is this idea of kind of urban metropolitan ecology, because, you know, there's always such a focus when you talk about major conservation projects, to think about the rural environment, you know, about these perceived wild landscapes, but to look at it in the context of a city or a metropolitan environment is, I think, is crucial, you know, as kind of, as Cal has said. And, you know, it put me in mind of a couple of things. You know, a few years ago, I wrote about the Pruitt-Igoe housing project in St. Louis in Missouri, you know, which was this exercise in social housing, in effect, an experiment in social housing in America, which ultimately failed. You know, it was 33 11-story slab blocks that were built. The idea was to, you know, to house the less well-off communities who were moving in from the farmlands, who were looking for work, and there wasn't ultimately ethnic diversity in terms of the people who lived there, and there wasn't support for the housing itself. And it was built in the 1950s, and it was very publicly blown up in the 1970s. I think it was on the cover of Life magazine as it was kind of blown up. And that site, that derelict site, is still there. And a few years ago, there was an international design project that looked at what you might do with that site. And a lot of the ideas that came through, I think it was about 2015, this happened. A lot of the ideas were about urban ecology and things like using the Missouri River and developing a mussel farm around this sort of space. And I kind of absolutely love those ideas, but unfortunately they were just ideas, whereas you're actually doing it. And I think that's fantastic that you're actually doing it. And you're just to end on something a little closer to home, just like Cal was saying, from Scotland from the Sky, we filmed at the site of Ravenscraig Steelworks, which was this absolutely vast, you know, industrial centre outside Motherwell, which again was demolished at the start of the 1990s. And now it's like a giant birch forest with deer running around, you know, right next to the M8 motorway, so Scotland's busiest motorway. So, you know, there is this kind of strange ecological transformation of that site. And it was like a country park, despite the fact that we landed our helicopter in the footprint of a cooling tower. So you kind of see how these things can change, and how there is a need to have this kind of focus on urban metropolitan ecology as well. So it's fantastic to hear about.
Yes, thank you very much, Jerry. And here, as we move into our next session, to examine the impact of the climate emergency on nature, is ecologist Jeff Waddell. And on the Love Scotland show, Jackie Bird said of Jeff, he is one of the heroes who makes sure Scotland's natural heritage is cared for and protected for generations to come. Jeff is Senior Nature Conservation and Heritage Advisor at the National Trust for Scotland.
When I first came to Mar Lodge, which was 19 years ago, when you walked out on the estate, all you could see were these old granny pine trees, and it was, I sometimes describe it as like an old people's home, you know, with no young trees at all. And there was nothing to be seen above the height of the heather at that point in time. But over the last 25 years, we've slowly reduced the deer population to reduce the grazing levels, because the deer were eating any young trees that were coming up. But now when you go out on the estate, you can see the response to that management, and there's young trees all over the place. Well, for me, what's special about this place is it's one of the parts of the UK that's got least influence of man, probably. And so it has a real wild land and sort of wilderness feel to it. But also it's about letting nature do its thing and letting natural processes be restored in the landscape.
Jeff, how is climate change affecting the National Trust for Scotland's work to conserve Scotland's nature? And also, can you tell us about how the National Trust for Scotland is responding to the climate emergency with nature-based solutions?
Yeah, thanks, Gus. And I think the easiest way to explain how nature has been impacted in Scotland is to talk about the impact on species. And National Trust for Scotland, I mean, we're very lucky. We've got 34 different nature conservation sites, natural estates across Scotland. Mar Lodge, which you saw in the video, is one of them. And I've got a great job where I get to go to these places and then try and figure out how do we restore them, how do we bring nature back, and obviously how do we lock up the carbon is becoming increasingly important in that work. And just by the nature of our properties, we've got 34. Scotland being Scotland, quite a lot of those properties are either mountain ranges or islands. So most of the species we are prioritising nature conservation work on are either alpine plants or seabirds. So in terms of alpine plants, we've got about 11 priority species, and these are things like saxifrages, gentians, beautiful plants, often quite rare and restricted to 1 or 2 mountains in Scotland. So they're obviously the focus of our conservation effort. But unfortunately, climate change, these are the first species in the firing line because summers are becoming drier and warmer. So these plants are desiccating. They're adapted to cold conditions in the mountains. And also, counterintuitively, in the wintertime, we're getting blasted by the cold because in previous decades, they were covered by snow, but now that snow is melted in the winter. And that exposes them to frost and wind in the wintertime. And then if we move on to our seabird islands, what's happening there is even more profound. The whole ecosystem is changing. And these seabirds are struggling to find food because of that. So we've got species like sand eels and copiopods, which are the prey items of these seabirds. And the oceans have already warmed up quite significantly. And what's happening is these cold water ecosystems are moving further north, and things like sand eels are becoming quite difficult for seabirds to find. And NTS, we've been monitoring alpine plants, we've been monitoring seabirds since the 1980s and prior. And we found that some of our seabirds have declined by 70%. And there's good years and there's bad years where the colony comes back a bit, but generally, and increasingly so, we're seeing quite poor productivity where seabirds are just, colonies are going downhill. And it's really sad to see. But I don't want to talk about negative impacts. I want to sort of try and think about the positives as well. And obviously, we've got a responsibility to, and a unique opportunity to deploy nature-based solutions to climate change. So take Mar Lodge, for instance, that beautiful video. What we're doing there is we're reducing the deer numbers, and that's allowing the trees to regenerate. And it sounds very simple, and ecologically it is quite simple, but politically it's actually quite difficult in Scotland because there's a lot of deer stalking interest in the Highlands. But I think what we're trying to prove at Mar Lodge is that we can have both. We can have these traditional deer stalking estates, but we can also bring back ecological processes to those estates, and we can stalk deer, and we can grow trees and bring back nature and biodiversity. We're also working on peat bogs, and you probably appreciate the Scottish climate is very damp, very mild, believe it or not. So we do have these incredible accumulations of peat, and these can be up to 10 metres deep, which is absolutely incredible, but you don't realise it until you stick a pole into the ground and see how far down it goes. But again, a lot of these peat bogs, in the past, people were just exploiting them for agriculture, so they burned them to improve the grazing. They ran big flocks of sheep, they ran big herds of deer, and also changes in the climate have also caused some of these peat areas to erode. So it's not all man-made damage, but what we're doing is we're going in with diggers to restore the peat, to remove gullies, to remove drainage ditches, take the grazing back off it, and that improves the biodiversity, and it also locks up a lot of carbon. So I think that's our role to play, but I think we need landowners all over Scotland, all over the world to put these nature-based solutions back in track, so we can use nature as a solution to climate change as well as reducing emissions. And then finally, from a nature point of view, something else that gives me optimism is nature itself. There's three qualities I want to mention about nature that I understand as an ecologist. The first is its adaptiveness. I mean, species can evolve, they can move range, they can integrate into new ecosystems. So as long as we don't damage the climate too much, nature will recover, nature will survive. And then secondly, it's got an incredible capacity to regenerate, and I think Cal's work kind of demonstrates that on these sort of brownfield sites, but that also applies to our uplands where we can restore bogs and native woodlands. And then finally, the third thing that just amazes me about nature and its ability to cope with climate change as long as we don't push it too far is this thing called homeostasis, which basically means steady state. The planet itself is kind of functioning like an organism. It has done through geological time, something called the Gaia theory from Professor Lovelock. And basically when the planet gets too hot, mechanisms kick in, whether that's more plankton in oceans sucking up carbon or more trees taking in carbon, and it brings it back to that equilibrium. So again, nature is resilient, but as long as we don't push it too far, as long as we don't damage habitats and we give it that capacity to regenerate, to adapt and to maintain that steady state, I'm quite optimistic. But obviously it does rely on us keeping carbon emissions in check.
Thank you, Jeff. That was fascinating. Just before we go to our other expert panelists for responses, I'm reminded that we are inviting the viewers to ask questions in the Q&A interface. If you have any questions, please enter them and we'll get to them towards the end of the presentation today. For the responses this time, may I start with you, Cal, and then I'll go to Jamie, followed by Jerry.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Jeff, for that. That was absolutely fascinating to see all the work that you're doing. And yeah, you talked there just about the Gaia theory, which is such a wonderful concept. And I keep sort of looping back to it, which is, I'm not sure that I subscribe to what Lovelock, I think, was initially proposing, that it is a sort of serious way to understand how it self-corrects the world. But I do think that it's a very helpful way for us to think of it almost as like a thought experiment, if you see what I mean. It's a wonderful way to think about how the world responds to the challenges and the stresses that we put it under. And there's a sort of equal and opposite theory called the Medea theory, which is that should we, as you suggested, push the Earth too far, we can sort of slip into positive feedback loops in which the Earth almost comes suicidal, hence Medea, the killer of her own children. And I think, as you say, you know, that's absolutely where we need to be focusing our efforts. You know, what are the bulwarks that we need to be putting in place to stop as much carbon as possible being released into the atmosphere? And peat bogs are such a huge part of that, being so valuable in terms of carbon storage. And of course, looking forward, it's going to be forests, especially on the grandest of scales. So I think too, you mentioned about appealing to landowners, and I think that's going to be very important. And the relationship between landowners and the communities that live on those, especially large estates in the Scottish context, are key in getting that sort of popular buy-in to working in all kinds of conservation efforts. So thanks again, an absolutely fascinating presentation. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And I've worked on and filmed at various of the sites that I think you've been working on. We did something at Achnasheen, which was looking at how taking the Sitka spruce plantation, cutting that down and actually replacing it with Scots pine and letting the Scots pine grow into that environment, removing the kind of commercial forestry and replacing that with the native trees, which was really fascinating. But I think in general, you know, one of the things that's a real positive with how we're now approaching conservation is that understanding of both biodiversity and ecosystems. Because I think there has been a habit for a long time of focusing on individual species and the protection of individual species and the promotion of individual species without a thought about what's the knock-on effect of that. How does the promotion of one species impact on another? And, you know, everyone in Scotland knows about the impact of the deer on trees, you know, that because there are so many deer, and the deer population in Scotland, I think, is still probably higher than it's ever been in history, and that has to be managed. That has an impact on the forests, and you have to develop fencing to allow forests to grow, to allow particular species of plant and tree to grow. And I think the fact that we're now starting to move beyond that and to understand the connections between things, or to begin to understand them, because often they are so complex that it's only when we start to intervene we see that we've pushed it too far one way or the other. But at least we understand that now, so we're on the right track in terms of what we're doing. But as Cal says, you know, Scotland, in terms of its land ownership, you know, it's a lot of Scotland is owned by not very many people, so it does require, you know, at the moment it's quite top down and doesn't necessarily look from the ground up about what we should be doing with our land. And I think that maybe needs to shift as we move forward into the future. But certainly the work that you're doing in Mar Lodge is a great exemplar for how we should be taking this forward in the future.
Well, Jeff, your work, I think, gives us great hope, quite frankly. I mean, we humans have destroyed so much of the biodiversity, but we're also the agents for bringing it back, as you point out. And a region like ours, it's an ecotone where the great forests of the East met the prairies of the West, and but for fires of Native Americans, you know, it would all be forest, but we had the prairie and wetlands and extraordinary biodiversity, but we've destroyed most of it. But there are these refugia, these pockets, you know, of rare nature that's still here. And we're on a major flyway. So for instance, the city of Chicago developed a nature and wildlife plan to figure out where can we create habitat for our migratory birds and for other creatures, you know. A good example that my organization has been involved with is Medewan National Tallgrass Prairie, a former arsenal where TNT was made, bombs for World War II, a lot of cleanup issues, but also huge grassland areas, and grassland birds are our most threatened in this part of the world. And so it's about 8,000 hectares, 20,000 acres. It's the largest ecological restoration for a prairie ever undertaken in this part of the world. There's great hope, you know, I think. But public-private is so key, and you've touched on that too with the private properties. And, you know, how do we create corridors for migration? How do we build more resilient these pockets that they have buffers, and how do we also make access for people to enjoy and love, and obviously our youth, I mean, they're the future and the hope of the planet. And so to have great programs where youth can connect to nature close to where they live, that's really part of our mantra here at Openlands. And the kind of work you're doing is, as I said, inspirational and needs to happen everywhere. So thank you.
Here. Our final examination of the climate emergency will focus on the built environment. Cal Flyn is a writer. Her book, Islands of Abandonment, is about what happens when nature is allowed to reclaim its place from abandoned places. And Cal, as I read your terrific book, I couldn't help but think of the chorus from a Tom Waits song. If there's one thing you can say about mankind, there's nothing kind about man. You can drive out nature with a pitchfork, but it always comes roaring back again. In an industrial and post-industrial world, there are many regions which are deeply impacted by human activities. You write inspirationally about natural regeneration in abandoned land. So please accept our invitation now to share your screen, and please also accept our thanks for sharing some of your incredible photographs to tell the stories of abandoned landscapes and how they recover. Cal Flyn.
Thanks, Gus, for a very generous introduction. I'm going to put some, unlike others here, I think the best thing for me to do is to share some still images while I'm talking. So I should hopefully have shared my screen so you can see some images. So yes, my book, Islands of Abandonment, came out over here in January and in the US in June. So I think most people are going to be in the US, and it looks like this where you are. So it's a book about abandoned places and I suppose what nature gets up to when we're not there. In it I go to 13 different locations around the world, all different sites, some of which have been very heavily impacted by humans, very damaged, and sort of study how they recover, how they regenerate, what processes that works through. So here is a couple of American sites that I went to. This is New York Bay, a ship graveyard, of which there are a number in the sort of Staten Island, New Jersey shoreline, and even around sort of certain parts of New York City. And I was there to look at organic pollutants settled as sediments in that area. And here is in Detroit, where I went out with some of the Michigan Humane Society. And I suppose what I was trying to get a sense of is this almost, well, we mentioned the Gaia theory earlier, and this sort of sense almost of divine forgiveness, if you want to think of it in that way, in as much as we can do a great deal of damage to the planet, but should we get out of the way, a great deal can be restored. And what tends to happen, so you talked very interestingly earlier, Jerry, about former arsenal, and I think what I really found exciting were these sort of large exclusion zones, no man's land and so on, when we really get that sort of landscape scale of recovery. But I'm also interested in these much smaller metaphorical islands in our midst. That might be a derelict car park, that might be a scrap of garden that hasn't been tended, or some kind of derelict site. I often talk about the Chernobyl exclusion zone because it's an instantly sort of recognizable example of the phenomenon that I was writing about. So there and in other locations, I studied how species sort of come in to fill the gap once we let them. And there, I'll just flick through. So we get a sense of it being quite a dangerous environment. Certainly it is impacted by radiation, and the species there are impacted, but there's a sort of trade-off against the lack of disturbance by humans. So we've got a 7-fold returning of wolves. We've seen bears come back for the first time in more than a century. And generally it's acting in many ways like a sort of, well, not exactly safe haven, but certainly a haven for many species in the relatively built up continent of Europe. So I also wanted to talk, it's a book that's general interest, and so I want to talk through the natural processes that sort of take place. So for that I came a lot closer to home. I went to West Lothian to look at the shale bings that we have there. So these are sort of slag heaps, as I think you would call them where you are. And these were created in the 19th century during shale mining and the creation of sort of paraffin type oil during the 19th century. And what's happening there is a sort of sense of basic ecological succession. And what it helped me to understand that the processes that are at work on man-made environments are the same processes as take place on natural environments. So this is a very similar situation as you might find on, say, a volcanic island that sort of bubbles up completely sterile in the middle of the ocean. Effects like seed rain or the dropping of seeds by birds all help these be taken over by new plant species. But for me, the chapter that actually gave me most pause for thought was the abandoned farmland in Estonia. So in Estonia, as in many places across the former Soviet Union, we see a huge regrowth of forestry. So this is a former collective farm that I visited in Estonia, and it and much of the land around it has been left entirely to its own devices since the early 90s, when that system fell apart. It's been very difficult to sort of reunite the farmland with its original owners. And so we see across the former Soviet Union, but also across large areas of China, South America, and now Europe, especially in countries like Spain and Italy, we find marginal farmland falling into disuse and forest regrowing on an enormous scale. We talked earlier about how forests are sort of regrowing and regenerating, and we talk about a country passing through its forest transition. And so this is when forestry starts regrowing on a very large scale. So it's actually gaining in forest instead of losing it, as was certainly the case in most countries through the 20th century. So this is just to give you a sense of where in the former Soviet Union is most affected by land abandonment and therefore the return of forests or grasslands, which can be very good carbon store. And we've seen this happen before in the US. So this is a map of forest cover of the US. You can see the enormous impact of farming and how by the early 20th century, there was a huge fall off in forest cover. But you can see since then, there is actually a return of forest. And that's particularly notable in areas like New England, where farmers moved to the Midwest just to find sort of more fertile ground. Maine, for example, had 30% forest cover in 1880. About now that's around 80%. So that's an enormous growth. And numbers of beaver and moose, white-tailed deer and bears and woodpecker have all rebounded too. So I think it gives you a sense of, you know, how landscape scale recovery is really possible. And the future is abandoned. This is not actually my photo, but I think it gives you a sense of how entire communities in many rural parts of the world are now falling into abandonment. So specifically in Europe, we've got Italy and Spain, as I mentioned, but Japan and Korea are actually very badly impacted by falling populations. And so in Japan, I think 1 in 8 properties is already abandoned, and that's forecast to rise to 1/3 of all housing stock by 2049. So I think we are going to see abandoned land on really enormous scales, especially as that population that is left becomes increasingly urbanized. And so I think we also need to think about these degraded forests. We have to learn to value them, as I spoke before about the potential. So they don't look like natural forests. They don't look like pristine forests. They're often a sort of feral mix of species. But they are constantly increasing in natural value and biodiversity as time goes on. So I think we can learn a great deal from abandoned landscapes that have been reclaimed by nature in many ways. And I think they can also teach us to value land that does not necessarily look wild or feel wild to walk in. So conservation, I think we've heard a lot about great acts of tree planting and so on, and I think that's extremely important. But we also need to learn when is a good time to step aside. And I'm sorry if I've possibly gone over my time there. There we go. Okay, so I would like to hand back. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cal. I've really enjoyed reading your book, and we're coming up to the hour mark, and with the agreement of our speakers, we'll bump over just by a couple of minutes beyond 60, and we'll get to the couple of questions that we have. So for responses, let me now start with Jamie, and then I'll go to Jerry, and finally to Jeff.
Thanks so much for that, Cal. That's fantastic, and I absolutely love what you're doing with your book and the landscapes that you're exploring. It's such an interesting perspective to have, to hear about the extent and the scale of abandonment across the world, because it's just something that people don't really think about and talk about. And as I mentioned, Ravenscraig, which is just down the road from me, it's exactly that same sort of thing. These huge spaces that used to be the sites for thousands of people to congregate for work, that are then, once they fall out of use, and they continue to fall out of use, they do over and over again. I mean, the story of industry is very much about certain industries that reach a period of prominence, and then technology moves on, or the landscape is exhausted. And I think that process of exhaustion is something else that will lead to kind of further abandonment in the future. But it's a really fascinating way of looking at how the world is changing and how the planet is changing. And also, I think, there's a kind of philosophical question about what value you place on a landscape. Does a landscape have to be productive and useful to humans to be valuable? And I think there's very much a kind of Enlightenment ideal, which may be attributable to the Scots, that it has to be producing something, it has to be put to work. And actually, I think maybe we're starting to realize that it doesn't have to be put to work, and it can be allowed just to be. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at the world.
Well, and Cal, thank you so much for sharing that. This whole concept of landscape recovery and of abandonment at all different scales of land and of buildings, I mean, we're seeing it all over the world. It's here in the US as well, in my own state, small towns that now are almost ghost towns. In the city of Chicago, tens of thousands of vacant lots, you know, concentrated in poor neighborhoods, underserved communities typically. A project that I worked on that Gus referenced briefly, I took him and his wife on a tour. It's the route of the historic waterway, the Illinois-Michigan Canal that gave birth to Chicago, a 100-mile system from connecting Lake Michigan with the Illinois River, ultimately down to the Mississippi. Well, that's a post-industrial landscape, but pockets of nature survived in part because of industry. They fenced off areas. There were derelict areas that were mined and so forth. And it's just extraordinary what's come back in terms of urban wildlife and plants as well. And so again, the challenges then of understanding that, of allowing it to happen, but to making it, incorporating it into our lives, because these are human stories, these are important natural resources. And so if they're derelict and abandoned, that suggests that they have no value. And so how do we translate that into positives and to understand, I mean, the best way to conserve energy with a building is to use an old one, you know, reuse it. It poses challenges, but rather than tear it down and put in the landfill, all of that and the work. And so just really rethinking kind of where we live, how we live, and what it means, you know, to recover a landscape in all of its forms and scales is so significant. And you provide a wonderful context for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. And I'm just thinking of your book and Islands of Abandonment. Maybe if an ecologist was to give it a title, it would be Ecological Restoration by Accident. And it also made me think of three paradigms. One is where humans intensively manage land for economic produce, where there's little nature, and then your book kind of covers the other end of the scale, where either humans abandon the land that restores itself, or either deliberately or accidentally. And then there's this third paradigm in between, which I think is one of the solutions we need for climate change. We need to have the benefits of that abandonment, of that ecological restoration, but also that productive land use. We need timber, we need meat, we need other products from the land. So we need to learn from both of those paradigms, find that place, that sweet spot in the middle where we can have sustainable land management. So yeah, really nice way of thinking about that.
Thank you, Cal, and thanks to all our panelists. We have two questions, and I'm going to ask them both, and then if any of our experts would like to jump on either one, please have at them. First question comes from Ivy, and it's been in the news lately that Indigenous people are invaluable in stewarding and protecting the land. What are organisations in Scotland and groups like Openlands doing to support land back movements? And then the second question, which comes from Megan, is as we listen today, what can we do on a day-to-day basis in order to feel like we are part of the work toward nature conservation? Who would like to take one of those? Jeff?
Can I just briefly answer both? I mean, in Scotland, we obviously don't have Indigenous people in the sort of native ethnic sense, but I mean, we do have people who are more closely connected to traditional land use, to ecologically rich land. And in Scotland, that's crofters. So these are people that have traditionally lived on small plots of land in the Western Isles and parts of the West Mainland of Scotland. And in some areas, that rich biodiversity, those ecosystem services have been maintained. but in others, the same sort of pervasive impacts of economic land management have invaded that system and degraded the ecology and that sort of cultural history. So I think in Scotland we need to value that traditional land use because Macar is such a biodiverse habitat. And then secondly, on the what can we all do topic, I mean that's such a big one. We're all kind of powerless individually, but I think there's obvious things we can do. I mean, you can support some of the nature conservation organisations out there, National Trust, Openlands. There's a massive plethora of all these conservation organisations, so do a bit of research, find out the one that's true to your heart and you want to support. And the other one is lobby. I mean, we need to convince each other, we need to tackle the climate emergency, restore biodiversity. You can write to your MP, just talk about it, just make it a topic of conversation in our society, get people thinking about it and thinking what can we actually do.
Yeah, I just agree with exactly what Jeff said there, and I was thinking the exact same thing about the second point. Is, you know, it's a question a lot of people agonize over. What can I do? What can I personally do? What can I do as an individual? I think one of the most basic things you can do is talk about it, talk to people about it, be vocal about it, and be vocal outside of your silos, because often these conversations can happen in bubbles and everyone agrees with each other, but it never goes beyond that. And, you know, there are large parts of the population who necessarily this is not a priority for them. And there has to be a process of trying to make it clear that it's a priority for all of us. And I think that's the thing you can do, everyone could do on an individual level, is raise the conversation to such a point that it can't be ignored anymore, or it can't be denied, or it can't be, you know, there are so many issues around discussions of climate change and climate crisis. But I think the shift in the last 10 years has been massive, and that's through people talking about it. So I think that's what we can keep doing.
And I would agree with that. I think that, we all have to become advocates for nature, obviously. And so many, especially, challenged, underserved communities are impacted most by negative climate repercussions. How do we then share tools with them that they give them voice, to help them have their voice? They have the voice, but what's the pathway, to help shape policy and so forth? Also, at least here in Illinois, volunteerism is a huge piece of ecological restoration. Children, families, people from all walks of life. I mean, there are direct ways that people can get involved in site-specific projects related to the indigenous people. I mean, this has been our region, a transportation corridor for millennia. And so many Native Americans have called it home, have camped here, have traveled through. And we have actually one of the largest urban Native American populations in the country. But we don't have that sense of place in the same way as out west or further north or other places where traditional Native American cultures have lived here forever, and they're still part of that fabric. So how do we connect both with the history and with the contemporary populations that are here in meaningful ways? It's a huge opportunity and I think a challenge for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of chime in with the below. I mean, in terms of the Indigenous groups, forgive me, I've got a better understanding of the sort of interface between government and Indigenous groups in Australia, but I think there are a lot of sort of parallels that you can bring across. And the key thing, I think, is that when dealing with Indigenous groups is sort of trying to ensure that conservation bodies and governmental bodies do not sort of impose their own way of doing things upon Indigenous groups, and being able to meet halfway and understand that Indigenous groups have a different way of thinking and a different way of dealing with things, and being able to sort of have a comfortable dialogue rather than sort of presenting a box ticking requirement that means that they have to sort of deal with a sort of different system, if that makes sense. So it's developing a dialogue. And in terms of what we can do on a day-to-day basis, I think that it's very true what Greta Thunberg says when she says no person is too small to make a difference, whether that is in making small changes in terms of what you buy on a day-to-day basis, you know, you are a small part of a trend. So it's all about changing our culture and our habits on a grander scale, but that every person is part of that. And I think being able to see yourself as part of a movement is really helpful. So if that means making friends and talking about it in your silos, but also reaching out across to people who might not necessarily agree, not being I suppose troublesome and necessarily sort of picking on people, but just to constantly be saying, you know, I'm making this decision, I'm doing this because of the environment.
Can I say how much I've appreciated and enjoyed the discussion today? You each have blown my mind in so many different ways. I've really enjoyed it. I have a lot to go and think about the future, and I'm going to be talking with my 2 young children tonight about many of the things that we've covered today. They're both fascinated by the future and the world around us, and to see the world through your eyes as experts and to see the world through my kids' eyes is both refreshing and gives some assurance and confidence that we have some solutions available to us. So on behalf of everyone who's listened in, I hope you'll accept our deepest gratitude and thanks. And I wish everyone out there who's been listening all the best, every happiness and good health in the future. Thank you very much.